when you get these plans, you'll get construction specifications, a list that will give you information about the lumber that you need for making all the other parts. There's an inner and an outer inwale, and then an exterior guard, and then a little lower guard. Now, because this piece wants to be 3/4 wide, but only 5/8 thick, what you can do is what I have here, which is a wider piece, and I've done my quarter round on both sides, so I have it on one and then the other, and this will allow me to rip out both of my lower guards. I'll just set this flat and cut it to 5/8 on each side, and that saves me from having a very thin piece of wood, fingers near a router, that sort of thing. Makes this process a whole lot easier. By all means, if you're confident with a router and you have setups that can handle taking tiny little pieces of wood in there, go for it, but I find this to be a lot easier. Great, so now we have two pieces that are 3/4 by 5/8, and they have their nice radius on them, and they're all set to go. So today we are going to put on the upper and lower guards. Now, since the boat is upside down, things can get a little bit confusing. This is the upper guard, even though it's lower here, and this is the lower guard. Fitting the upper guard is pretty straightforward. You're lining it up with the top edge of the shear plank. It's also going to rest on the notches on your molds. The easiest way to get started with that is just clamp it on, probably at the center. Work your way back with the clamps, lining it up, and then I drove a single screw back at the stern, countersunk quite deeply. Once you have it in place and you know where you want it to be, get inside and you'll drill 4 screws from the inside out. And then pop it off, lay epoxy, throw it back on there, and basically do the same thing again. Be fussy with where it is, clamp it nice and tight, drive your screws starting from the stern all the way forward. I omitted screws up forward at the bow, really just because there's not enough room to get in there. We're going to put our faith in epoxy like we do. Here. Okay, so I got my epoxy on there. It's a good idea to make a little mark where you want your piece to be. You'll dry fit it before you take it off to spread epoxy. Make a little mark in the center of the boat so you know where you want it roughly. Because you start at the end with a fastener, and that will be my actual index for putting the whole thing together. And I've sunk this quite a ways because I'm going to be shaping this and taking off a lot of material off of this corner. So this screw wants to be pretty deeply countersunk in order to be out of the way of that shaping. I've already got fastener holes in here, but still going to make sure before I drive those fasteners that my guard is flush with the shear there. And that might require throwing clamps back on before you drive fasteners in. So I'm going to work from the stern forward and sort of drive some fasteners, come back and clamp it up, and repeat. So you'll be able to see a line there. I made that mark first with a ruler, but really this and the shear of the plank is going to tell you where it wants to be. And you just have to make sure that it's lined up. Quite happy. You'll find that your dry fit will be a lot easier than this, and part of that is because you didn't have anything wet in there for things to sort of slide around on. So obviously you're going to be able to use those pre-drilled holes to sort of index where your piece is, but things can and will shift around and not lay exactly the way they did when you did it dry. So be careful and take your time with this step. Make sure that all your marks line up and your edges are where you want them to be. Now, these screws don't have to be really aggressively countersunk or anything. The inwales will cover these up, so you won't even really need to putty them. So I'm chowdering up this plywood. It's okay, don't matter. And then clearly screwing from the inside of the boat out, just so I have material for this screw to grab onto. If you wanted to go the other way, you would have to, you know, drive a screw into a 1/4 inch of plywood, bung things. It'd be a real mess. Pain in the butt. So this is the way to go. I'm using a pad to clamp here, and that's really just because these particular clamps like to leave little dents when you really crank them down. So avoiding having to patch that, putty that sort of thing. And then I have opted to not drive fasteners in this last section from the from station 2 to the transom, and that's really just because there's not a whole lot of room in there. I couldn't bodily get in there, so I am relying on power of epoxy. I might, if I'm feeling anxious about it, once the boat is off the molds, I might drive a couple screws in there just because this is a big high tension area. So for now, I'm clamping things up, and I'll drive a few more screws back behind station 2. So once you've done this, you might see that there's some spots where there's not squeeze out. Check all your molds and see if the guard's trying to pull the plank off the molds. Tack it down with a drywall screw. There might be spots where things are sort of pulling away. Double check things as you go cleaning up and make sure it's all happy. A little bit of dangle out of there. Okay, now that's on, and we can get started on the lower guard. Your lower guard is a little bit different. You're going to get locations for this off of your plans because it's not parallel to this upper guard. Locating the lower guard, you want to use the plans that you have here. You have 3 stations, and then on the sail plan, you'll have bow and stern location relative to the shear. So what I did was use my scale rule, figure out my distance to the shear, and then go to the boat and mark that on the plank, and do that for all 3 of these. So station 2, station 6, and station 10. And then on the sail plan, essentially do the same thing, but instead of it being on the station, which is perpendicular to the water line, it's on the angle of the transom. So a little bit of a different number, but essentially the same thing there. That gives me 5 7/8, 5 3/4 or so. And then mark that point here. Tack the batten on with some nails, and I step back, eyeball the line, make sure it looks nice. You do want that sweep. You don't want it to follow the shear. You want it to kind of sweep up on both ends. That is just sort of a visual little trick, makes it look nice and sweet, and it's nice. Make sure it's a nice fair line. I got my line on there, top and bottom, and that's because the batten is 3/4 of an inch wide, and this piece is 3/4 of an inch as well, so you can just draw both of those lines. I went through and drilled holes from the outside in, so that when I came to drill my holes for the screws, I knew exactly where to go. Didn't have to do any sort of guesswork and run a screw out through the side of that piece. Now this piece is sort of, it's decorative, but it's also functional in this context. It creates a nice sort of sweet looking sheer plank, so to speak. Splits up this big wide plank visually. You have the option of painting this upper part a contrasting color. And then it also is structural. It'll strengthen this wide and relatively thin piece of plywood and help it stay nice and strong. And I did the same thing with this as the upper guard, where I opted to not drive any screws in this section in here. It's tough to get your head and a drill up in there. If you have a right angle drill and you feel like you can do it, go for it. Also have the option of driving a couple screws once the boat is flipped over if you're not trusting that epoxy bond. But you should. So when I dry fit this, I did make a few marks, just little hash marks to indicate where I want to set this on the boat, and then it doesn't have to be exactly on there at first. You can just try to get a clamp on. All right. Now, it's not quite right. Okay. And this is a good moment to double check the one that I've already got done. It's the same as here. Great. So in this process, you might want to clean up your squeeze out a little bit early, just so you can see that line, because you're trying to go to that line again that you made previously. Tighten up that clamp. And just as I did with the upper guard, I'm going to get in there and sort of fasten, clamp and fasten, clamp and fasten, and work my way all the way down. So obviously when you're dry fitting, you're going to want more of these, or have them spread out and clamp the whole thing in place when you drive your screws. I'm just sort of doing it this way so that I can sort of fine tune where it's landing. And another thing that's important with this one, you're driving your screws from the inside out, but those fasteners aren't going to be covered like they are on the upper guard. So you do want to give those a little bit of a countersink. It doesn't have to be very much, but enough to get a little bit of thickened epoxy in there and cover up those fasteners. There it is. Oops, sometimes the epoxy reacts a little bit with ballpoint pen ink, and it can make the line disappear, which is a little bit nerve-wracking. But I found it. Yay.
So we've got a few more sections of fasteners to put in, and I'm going to go ahead and clamp down the bow end of this now. You'll find when you're springing a batten in place that you have a fixed point, say here, and that when you move this end up or down, it won't just affect this short area, it'll affect farther back as well. So bringing this down will cause a little bit more shape even behind your fixed point. I mentioned that because I'm going to fix this down. I might let that out a little bit and see where it wants to land, but should be in the right place for now. Actually wants to up a tiny bit. Is it? That's better. Okay. I don't know. I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse of doing this kind of work, and that I tend to see 30 seconds and sixteenths and differences that are teeny tiny to most people's eyes. They don't see these differences, but to me it like pops out and is like, ah. So it's a good thing, but it also can catch you in a little bit of a feedback loop of fussing and fighting things and trying to get things exactly, but sometimes that's not necessary. You gotta learn when to just say, that's good enough, that'll do, and move on. There's absolutely contexts in which it is super important to have a highly accurate thing, but I've spent way too long on things that someone else might never see. Okay, so we have this all clamped up. I'm going to let it cure overnight. Since we've got a bunch of stuff in the way, it's a little tough to clean up that epoxy, so we'll come back at it with a heat gun. Once these are all set, I'll cut these ends flush with the transom, give them a little bit of a curvature, and then a lot of curvature on this upper guard, and that is because we'll be putting padded gunnel guard around this, and you want to give it a nice easy turn to come around. So that is why I didn't put a fastener in the bow end, because I have to sink it really far. I'm going to let the epoxy do its work.